Okay, I guess it is that time to start once again. Okay, so obviously, this week, kind of continuing on with the material we started last Wednesday. We only did half a class last Wednesday, obviously. So today we should be finishing. Well, we definitely will finish up talking about work. We'll get into talking about families. Families is a longer unit. So there's a lot of stuff that I think is interesting to talk about when it comes to young people and families on a couple of different measures, but I'll talk about that in a second. One really quick thing to mention, midterm grades are up, right? I just finished marking the last one maybe 20 minutes ago. Class average was about 80, right? So pretty good. You did way better than my winter term one where they had like a 74. But usually spring semester students are a little bit more hardcore and committed, so that's kind of expected. If you want to kind of go over it, right, you want to ask questions about it or anything like that, go ahead and book an appointment. And if you're looking at mostly we do these online, right? We do them through Google Meet. So even if you're, at work, and you have like 15 minutes, we can usually knock one of these off in 15 minutes. We can do it really quickly on Google Meet, and I'll, screen share and show you, where you lost marks on the exam. But honestly, most of you did pretty well. So I'm not too concerned, and I'm quite happy with an 80% grade. I don't know if we had any Q&A slides. I don't know if that's from today. I don't know. I grabbed a random tea bag from the CCR office because I need to refill my teas on the main floor. So I actually don't know what the tea of the day is. I'm going to say sleepy time, maybe. It's a good choice for before class. I don't know. It was a mix of celestial seasonings. I was like, I need a tea bag. Here we go. Okay. I just have my plain old green mug today. I don't have my Tears of My Students mug, which I usually use when I'm marking. That was a gift from a student, and I find it funny. Okay, so any questions from the room or anywhere else about exam or anything? Okay, good. If you have any questions, do feel free to throw them in there. Okay, I'm going to shut the door now. I don't know why. Just don't like the door open. Actually, because sometimes people walk by and talk loudly, and it can be a little annoying. All right, so last time, what were we talking about? So we were talking about work, right? And obviously we went through, some of the kind of history around, things that have changed the working conditions of young Americans and Canadians, going back really to the middle part of the 20th century. And then, for the last little bit of the class, we were looking at some very specific Canadian data. And particularly here, and I apologize, I forgot to erase all of the markup from last time. We were talking about, this assessment from Richard Diaz, who's an economist working at IceCap Capital or Asset Management, kind of an interesting guy, with some interesting and I think very, very relevant ideas. And his basic kind of argument that the labor situation and the work situation for young Canadians should be a lot better than it is, right? Basically that, as the boomers retire, we should see labor shortages, which should mean that you need to work harder to recruit young workers, better wages, incentives, these kinds of things, right? As businesses fight to attract younger workers. And then you should have an increased focus on productivity, largely because Canada's productivity here has been really, really poor, but also because as you have fewer workers, you're going to need to maximize your output per worker. And what Diaz argues is that none of these things have really happened in Canada. We have really high youth unemployment, right? almost 15% youth unemployment in Canada, and a relatively low labor force participation for young people. From a historic perspective, we do have rises in wages, but well below the rates of older workers, right? And we saw that here, right, on this chart. We still have a pretty big gap, between the wages of older and younger workers, and that gap has actually been getting bigger over time. And our productivity continues to lag, right? And I showed you we're in the kind of bottom quartile of the OECD countries. One thing I will say, I was just out and about this weekend, and I saw something that I hadn't seen in a while. I was in Starbucks I had to drive my oldest daughter out somewhere, and I had to drag my youngest son along, so I got him appeasement Starbucks. So I'm like, okay, you have to be dragged along on an hour-long car ride because you're too young to stay home. So on our way back, we'll pick up something overly sugary and a pastry. And at the Starbucks, right, as I was waiting for my order, there was a sign up that said, Starbucks, hey, come work for us. And they'll, what was one of the things it was, they partially cover your tuition or reimbursement for tuition and textbooks. So again, I think that signals that, the labor market is probably tightening a little bit, and companies like Starbucks are looking at ways to attract younger workers, people who, might say stay for 4 years at working at Starbucks to help pay their tuition. So it kind of solves a couple problems for Starbucks. It minimizes things like churn, right? We talked about that. Churn is hard on companies because you have to keep retraining people, especially a place like Starbucks, which is I would say middle skilled, right? Making a latte is not as easy as, say, flipping a burger or dunking some French fries. It's not super skilled, but it's, requires some skills. So you're starting to see that creep into the market again. So that may be because of some tightening in the labor market. Okay. Sorry, I'm jumping back and forth. That is what I do. Okay. So what else did we talk about last time? I guess we started talking about, or we were midway through talking about temporary foreign workers, right? So this is one of Dias's big complaints, particularly that largely driven by businesses, right, wanting to keep down labor costs. We've imported in Canada, it's hard to tell exactly how many, but it's probably somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million temporary foreign workers in the span of 8 years, right? Which has affected a bunch of things, right? So obviously it's created pressure at the bottom end of the job market, right? A lot of jobs that would have gone to younger, less skilled workers have been kind of soaked up by temporary foreign workers. And it's obviously also put a upward pressure on housing, which is another kind of concern for Gen Z, right? As they try to move out of their parents' house, get independent, it's difficult when, housing costs essentially your entire salary. We've seen big shares of temporary foreign workers, especially in industries that used to be dominated by young workers. And it's a very exploitative program, right? It's one that I think doesn't serve temporary foreign workers that well, and it certainly doesn't serve young Canadians very well, but it does serve big businesses really well because they get, ample access to a cheap supply of labor that is very inflexible, right? They can't go look for other jobs because of the way the program is structured. Okay. And I guess we left off here, right, in terms of questions around other things going on. Hang on. Well, I guess I won't. I was going to erase everything, and I'm like, that'll take too long. Okay. So other things, right? The productivity lag. Because all things being equal, if we were seeing big rises in productivity, we would still be seeing young workers do better, right? And again, Canada, when it comes to productivity, is in the bottom quartile, right? With some very unproductive economies, right, in the OECD. Like the UK, Mexico, sorry, I was having trouble reading Mexico there, and other markets where, Mexico especially, right? If you think of Mexico, Mexico tends to be pretty low skilled. And so, Mexico, you don't want to be in the same quartile as Mexico generally, because as a developing economy, right, They've got a lot of lower skill, say, manufacturing jobs and service jobs, especially in tourism, right? Not particularly high in productivity. So you want to be, definitely way over here as opposed to way down here. Okay. All right. So one of the things that Diaz points to that has really sort of distorted the market around productivity is capital investment, right? Capital, so money that banks or investors have will tend to follow to places where they feel like they can make a lot of money. And Canadian real estate, because it's been so profitable, right? The values have been going up and up and up for essentially like 20 years, driven largely by really low interest rates. So you can borrow a lot of money to buy even an average house, right? I remember when my wife and I were house shopping for the house we're living in now, like I'm a professor and she's an elementary school teacher. We don't exactly have like millionaire wages, and yet like the mortgage broker was like, oh, we can give you guys a loan up to like $850,000, right? Like you can buy quite a bit of house. We did not buy that much. We went with less than half of that. But they were like, oh, the interest rates are so low. What that does is it tends to drive up the cost of housing, right? Because people will way overpay for housing. Mortgage brokers and real estate agents will be like, no, you can totally afford to, outbid someone else by borrowing even more money. Now, okay, in terms of productivity, what this does, it ties up a lot of money that might be used for software, equipment, and other things that increase productivity in housing, right? Because big investors will put that money that they have into loans for people, loans for companies, and other ways to get money out of real estate, right? And rising, low productivity and rising housing prices are both bad for Gen Z. Low productivity tends to affect unemployment rates, and obviously high housing prices makes it really hard for them to step into adulthood in a lot of ways. Okay, so just another perspective on the kind of TFW question. And this one I always think should be taken with a grain of salt. It comes from this guy, but I do think it's fair to present it. Mark Holth, who's an immigration lawyer, right, in Alberta, one who specializes in temporary foreign workers. And basically he said, TFWs are not the problem in Canada because, the temporary foreign, or specifically because he thinks it doesn't put downward pressure on wages. Specifically, so it does, TFWs don't work for cheaper than Canadians would because the program requires employers, A, to prove there's no Canadian available, and to do the job that they're paying at the prevailing wage rate. Now, one thing I'll say is he's right. Technically speaking, yes, companies need to prove that there's no Canadian that'll do the job in order to get what's called a labor market impact assessment. Right, so to bring in a temporary foreign worker, you need to basically do a couple things. You need to post the job somewhere, do some interviews, and prove that there's no Canadian worker that's willing to do the job. Now, what I'll say is this process is incredibly corrupt, and it's also one of those things that because the number of applicants, right, in the last 8 years was somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million, the federal bureaucracy that manages labor market impact assessments was completely overwhelmed, and they were basically rubber stamping every application. So, very corrupt thing. And there's lots of evidence of, or lots of accounts, lots of journalism that's been done where people like, I'm not accusing this person in particular, but immigration lawyers working with employers and people in, the country of origins of temporary foreign workers were collecting as much as 40 to 50,000 Canadian dollars, where basically like someone in India or the Philippines was paying that money to like the immigration lawyer, someone in that, like a finder, and often the company that was looking for a temporary foreign worker, they're actually paying, up to $50,000 to buy a labor market impact assessment so they could then get a job in Canada, right? So it's a very, very corrupt system that's poorly run, like a lot of government programs. So, what Holth says is, the TFW or program is not meant to put downward pressure on wages. And what he blames is actually international students, right, who can obtain an open work permit after graduation. And, one of the things that happened during COVID is that basically student worker or international student worker programs were opened up widely, right, to students that were in Canada. And, Holt is correct here. This has led to some international students, after graduation, often from sort of fraudulent education programs, right? They came over to like Jeff's special super Canadian college, right, and earned a 2-year certificate or a 6-month certificate in, I don't know, whatever. You get the idea, right? Like you can start one of these colleges pretty easily, and you had international students coming, taking, especially in Ontario, taking these certificates, and then after they graduated, getting an open work permit, and often agreeing to work for very little. Okay, sorry, let's see some long quotes. So it's a program that's been poorly administered by the federal government. According to the federal government, more than 1 million people had valid permits to study at Canadian universities, collège or cégep in Quebec in September 2024. Desjardins, so the big Quebec-based bank, Desjardins, says the decision of the Canadian government to relax work restrictions, including allowing international students to work for more than 20 hours per week during the pandemic, led to a sharp increase in the population growth of young workers between 20 and 24 years old, right? So again, more supply equals, lower wages. It puts downward pressure on wages, and there's more people filling in those starter positions that a lot of students would, be looking for around this time of year. And I will say, just as kind of, that's not anecdotal, in terms of data, the highest summer unemployment rate for university and other college students in the last 50 years in Canada happened in the summer of 2025, right? So 2025 was the hardest year for young Canadians to find temporary employment during the summer break. Okay, do I have the same thing here twice? I do. Oh dear. I apparently have the same thing in 2 places. Okay. Oh, here's the other part. However, as the pandemic moved into the rearview mirror and economic activity normalized, this deluge of available labor well outpaced demand, putting upward pressure on youth unemployment rate, right? So that's what we've seen. And again, this is mainstream financial analysis. Okay. It is on. The live stream is on YouTube. Oh. Let me double checky. Is the stream there? Yes. Did I put the stream in the wrong place? Possibly. Cough, cough. I went there and I meant to turn it on. Oops, that's the wrong one. I need YouTube Studio. See, no one ever tells you as a professor that you need to master live streaming and web technologies. Okay. Live. It's there. Oh, did I forget to hit save? Okay. I thought I had done that. Okay, now let's go to playlists. Maybe I put it in fall. There. Okay. I don't know if someone could write in the comments. Oopsie doodles. It's there now. Oh, the live is working. Okay. Oh, you want me to turn on subtitles? Well, okay, so in the food ideas, I collect viral recipes I want to try. And in the anime, I actually don't know what's in there, to be honest. That's probably my son who put stuff in there on my YouTube. Wait, where did my slideshow go? Okay, there it is. Okay. All right, I'm good. Apologies for not putting that in the right place. All right. Subtitles are now enabled. All right. So largely, right, what this comes down to is government policy. Um, and there's sort of a couple of different periods that we can talk about because the TFW program, oh, that always happens when the subtitles move me up. Okay, TFW program, right, was created by the Harper government. So the Harper conservatives in the 2000s, right? The Harper government then was succeeded in 2015 by the Trudeau Liberals, right? That's the government that was then in power for 9 years. And under the Harper government, right? So here under Stephen Harper, the rule was if the local unemployment rate was over 6%, right? So, whether it's provincial, right? And I think Edmonton's unemployment rate today is about 6.8%. Might be a little bit higher than that, actually. But it had been up as high as 8% at certain points. But if it was over 6%, you couldn't get a labor market impact assessment to bring in a foreign worker. What happened, though, is under the Trudeau Liberals, right? So under Katy Perry's boyfriend, though he wasn't at the time. I don't know why. That will never cease to amuse me. I was prime minister. Now I'm dating Katy Perry. Okay. That's a life trajectory. Trudeau Liberals removed that requirement in 2022. And now with, so when I looked at this in the winter, unemployment nationally in Canada was 6.9%. Oh, there it is. In Alberta, it was 7.8%, and in Ontario, 7.9%. And the government is still allowing TFWs to come in, right? It slowed a little bit. These changes were announced by the Liberals in April of 2022, and it allowed, along with, scrapping that rule, it allowed companies to raise the percentage of foreign workers. They were increasing it from 10 to 20%. And in some cases, and this is especially true of food services, up to 30% of their workforce. Now, some of this has been slowed down. The Carney Liberals, Mark Carney, current Prime Minister, alumni of the same high school I went to, we invited him to our 25-year high school reunion, although we were not in the same class because he's considerably older than me. He did not come, though that would have been fun. What he said, right, so this comes from this article here, that businesses, right, so when he talks to businesses around the country, their number one issue was tariffs, and their number two issue was access to temporary foreign workers. So again, this is something that I think is largely driven by businesses wanting to increase their margins, right, increase profitability by paying low-wage workers as little as humanly possible, right? Now, again, some of this has slowed down a bit, and the Carney Liberals are working to slowly reform the program. And so the flow of temporary foreign workers has stopped, although there are still labor market impact assessments being granted. Okay, cool. Oop. Right. All right, so a couple more slides, then we'll be done work. We'll start talking about families. Okay, so a couple other things and just some notes when it comes to young workers. No bother. Like Winnie the Pooh, I will say, oh bother. Now my pen no worky. What has happened? I have killed Microsoft PowerPoint. Oh dear. Class dismissed. Okay, I'll close the... Wait, did it unfreeze? Okay, everything is great. Everything is perfect. Nothing is wrong. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit, especially here, we're going to talk a couple things. This one mostly about women and young women in the labor force. Bless you. Okay, when we talk about harassment, right? Obviously, harassment used to be really kind of normal course, especially for women in the workplace, right? If you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and less so in the 90s, but it was still there. It was, sort of tolerated in the workplace, that there would be a lot of sexual harassment, especially of women, right? Like this creepoid. Ooh, he's creepy. Right. Obviously, laws have gotten stricter about this, and there's more recourse for people who get harassed. Even then, somewhere in the range of 87, so almost 90% of women will report some type of sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, obviously, this can come from different sources, and depending on the industry you're in, right, it can come from, I won't write this down, coworkers. It can come from, employers or bosses. It can also come from customers, right? So there's a pretty broad palette to paint with when we talk about harassment in the workplace. And there's two basic types, especially when we're talking about coworkers and bosses. The first one is quid pro quo, right? So this is basically where sex or some kind of sexual favor is exchanged for continued employment or promotion, right? Like if you want that promotion, meet me at this hotel at this time, right? And, it's probably less prominent than it was when I worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. It actually, and again, this was a hellscape beyond words. It was pretty normal course for some of the older male bosses to do this to women. I worked with a lot of women there, and, one of them just quit outright because, this was what she was asked to do. It's like, oh, you want to be a branch manager? Well, here's what you have to do. And it was like, okay, you basically had to go meet the boss and have sex with him, right? And while it's ugly, it still definitely happens, right? And it can be for keeping your job or for getting a promotion or for getting hired in the first place. The other one is a poisoned work environment. This is also very common. And this can be anything that sort of sexually charges the workplace, right? So it could be, someone being treated in a sexualized fashion, off-color jokes being made within earshot of that person or about that person, rumors, anything that is kind of sexual in nature can constitute a poisoned work environment. So that the work is sexualized, right? That's another kind of thing that can happen. Work is sexualized. Women are expected, particularly, to dress in a particular way. This is really common in food services, right? I'll admit here, I haven't been to an Earl's in like 15 years because yuck, the food was gross. But I do remember this, a while back, is you kind of noticed that the cleavage got more displayed and the skirts got shorter at Earl's for a while. I don't know if that is still the case, but this was pretty common, especially in the 2000s, for there to be a standard dress code, especially for female employees, that was particularly revealing, right? So food services, right, bars are notable for this as well, but it can happen in professional settings as well. I have one friend, and she's a very attractive lady. And when she was kind of starting out her career in oil and gas, she would be brought along to meetings with other companies and told that she should, dress nice because the people at the other company really liked her, right? They thought that her attractiveness was a, bless you, asset to getting some kind of deal made, right? So this is still pretty common. And yeah, women's attractiveness is also sometimes taken into account when it comes to hiring and advancement. One last example here, then I'll move on. I had a friend who was a busser at Moxie's. Moxie's was, I know it still exists. They closed down or restructured a while ago. Before that, they were one of these chains that really prized the attractiveness of their servers. And basically, one of the things that would happen, because this was the early 2000s, is when a woman would come in to hand in her resume because she wanted to work at Moxie's, basically her job was to kind of size her up in terms of attractiveness. And then, if she was attractive enough, just hand in the resume to the manager without an application, without any note. And if she wasn't attractive enough, she was supposed to write a special code on the front of the application, which was 110, which she told me later, it was a secret code because if you connect the two ones, right, by a diagonal line. It spelled no, like this is a person that was judged not attractive enough to work at Moxie's, right? So again, this kind of thing happens. I'm so far out of this now that I don't know if this is still the case, but I imagine so, right? I imagine this still happens. Maybe it still happens at Earl's. I would have to go back and find out, and I don't want to. If I wanted to pay $30 for an average burger, I could go to any number of restaurants. Okay, and workplace safety. That's not true. I did go to an Earl's once, but it was for a business lunch, because we're hiring a new professor in the department, and I was on the committee. So I lied. I have been there once in the last 15 years, the one off campus, but I didn't notice because I was focused on other things, what was going on. Okay, this is like my second last slide or the last one? Oh, bother. Okay, everything is broken. We can never know. We must just go for it. Okay, workplace safety. When it comes to young workers are also at some of the highest risk of getting injured on the job outside of super high injury prone positions. So resource extraction and utilities work, right? Those are the two highest categories of injuries. But outside of that, young people are at particularly high risk of injury for a couple of reasons. The first one is they're seldom unionized, so there's no one to speak up for them, which means that employers can push them to do things they might be uncomfortable with. The jobs are usually pretty low skilled, and because employers in these fields assume churn, right, as we talked about churn, slightly further down, churn, because employers assume that there's going to be churn, they don't want to invest in a lot of workplace training, right? Okay, so again, I'll give you an example. So poor safety training due to high turnover. And again, I'll give you an example from when I was younger, and I understand for people who have taken this class that this is still roughly the case. I worked at a grocery store. It was my first job. I was 16 years old and in high school, right? And in the summers, I would go work there as, kind of restocking the shelves at night. And this is a job that requires a lot of lifting, right? And I had to do safety training. And what was the safety training that I did? It was a 15-minute video, right? They sat you in a room and you're nodding, so that means they still do this, right? And it basically amounted to lift with your knees. Don't lift with your back, your knees. Your knees are your friend, right? And there was some other things like stuff. It was a general purpose video, right? So it was for like the cashiers too. It was like, if someone robs you, just do what they want. And it's like, okay. I will say I worked there with like 6 of my friends. And one of my friends is the one who got me the job. And through the couple summers I worked there, almost all of us at some point injured our backs, right? Because we really didn't know what we were doing, and we were just trying to get this stuff done as fast as possible. So like we didn't lift with our knees. We didn't know how to use the lifting straps or anything like that. So we just kind of like hand bombed everything onto shelves. So that's one category, right? Poor training. I never worked in fast food, but the other one that tends to be true for young workers is that they tend to work in chaotic, what are called just-in-time working conditions. Like I said, really typical of food services. So just-in-time, right, basically is you produce whatever product you're making as demand comes in, right? So it's a principle out of like Japanese management, but it's something you'll recognize from the food services industry, right? Like nobody wants to eat a hamburger where the ketchup is hot, right? So like if you made like McDonald's, for example, if you went to any particular McDonald's in Edmonton or anywhere, they could tell you probably down to a rough science how many of each type of burger they're going to sell at lunch, right? Because every single day kind of looks the same, right? And they've got metrics going back a decade, if they've been open for 10 years, decades, right? Or a decade at least, saying what their demand is. So they could produce those burgers in advance, but nobody wants a burger that's been sitting under a heat lamp where the mayonnaise is the same temperature as everything else, scalding hot, unless you want to eat at Burger King. But Burger King is disgusting, and no one should ever eat there. And I will die on this hill. No one can ever convince me that this isn't true. Honestly, the worst meal I've ever had is at Burger King. And I can tell you exactly which Burger King. It was in the US, in Billings, Montana. It was inedible. Even my kids, who are generally not, when it comes to chicken nuggets or like whatever, they wouldn't eat the chicken nuggets. So bleh. Burger King bad. Do not eat at Burger King if you can avoid it. Make them go out of business. They're doing a big push back into Edmonton, and it's wrong. Okay, but no one wants to eat the hot mustard Burger King sandwich, right? So what does McDonald's do is when you order, they produce that burger. Now what that creates is kind of chaotic conditions, right? And I can guarantee you McDonald's busy times are somewhere around, okay, so there's the, okay, I can't go either direction. 11, there, right down here. 11 to about 2 o'clock, and then roughly 5 until 7:30, right? That's your kind of lunch and dinner rushes. And in that time, that's where almost all of the demand for food comes from. So when that happens, you're rushing around the kitchen, you're moving around, right? Things happen. And the number one injury for young people is a grease burn, right? So in kind of reporting, the number one injuries that young people get is a grease burn, right? Often from like spills from deep fryers or something like that. Okay, so the more chaotic the work conditions, the more likely you are to get injured. And then, of course, subject to crime, especially robberies in retail. I know from students I've had in the past, liquor stores, particularly bad for this, right? Where people will come in and basically help themselves to merchandise, especially right around closing time, right? And if people try to intervene, or even if they don't, sometimes they can be injured. And yeah, like we were when I worked at the grocery store, young people are usually blamed for their own problems, right? It's like, oh, did you lift with your knees? Well, really your fault, rather than the bad training. Okay, I think I'm almost done. But I can't check because everything is broken. Oh, okay. Apparently, we're never going to be able to check. There we go. Educational inflation and credentialism, right? So we've talked about the educational inflation before, and it's kind of, misbegotten cousin is what you would call credentialism, right? So we know this. So we talked about it when we talked about education. We've seen an increase in the level of kind of credential that you need to get into that base tier of the labor market. Entry-level jobs increasingly are asking for a bachelor's degree, right? And there's no particular reason for it other than it's just sort of been decided that that's the base criteria. And as I said before, some are saying, right, a master's degree is the new bachelor's. And yeah, even low-skilled jobs like enterprise rent-a-car will demand that people have a post-secondary degree. I was told when I applied there, they would never hire anyone without a post-secondary degree, and I never figured out why, because a monkey could do that job. And, not a particularly intelligent monkey, just one of the really dumb monkeys. No, I don't, want to debase the intelligence of monkeys in general. It was not a job that required much intellect. Although, I will say I worked with some people who seem to struggle with the basic tasks, so maybe I'm wrong. That said, the bachelor's degree has become that base credential. What this has done, right, is it shifted, and we talked about this a little bit, when we talked about Gen X and their predilections as well. It shifted, a university education from what used to be, kind of a really high level of education, one that was about, learning about ideas, bettering yourselves, bringing things to your community, to just another credential, right? And so what we see is in polls, when we ask students why they're going to university, almost inevitably, it all revolves around getting a job, right? And again, this wasn't the case in the past, right? And yeah, so it's all about credentials, right? Everything you're doing is just for the credential. And, there's a lot of students in university that probably would be well served by other things, but they've been told they need to be here, so they sort of miserably slog through a 4-year degree. And trust me, go on Reddit, any university Reddit, and you'll see some sub-selection of students who are like, I don't know why I'm here, I hate this, right? That's, they're essentially sort of victims of credentialism. Okay. Does this mean the coursework of a BA is now easier as well? I mean, I think there's some evidence of this. I definitely think like standards. Again, you're all very bright, and I'm not saying like, yeah, we just let anyone in here. That's not true. But definitely, I do think there's been a change in standards, right, and a push towards massification as well, right? I mean, just like super anecdotal. I don't know if this even matters. When I started teaching this class in 2015, the first time I taught it, it had 70 students, right? We're now up to the point, and this is decisions from the higher ups, where regularly this class is now scheduled for 150 students in the fall and winter terms. So it's much less, well, I guess it's, everything's gotten bigger. Class sizes have sort of inched up. I think the quality of the education maybe has declined as well, but some of the standards have gone down too, in terms of what we're teaching and how it's being taught. I don't know if it makes it easier, but maybe. I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, I'll say that when I did my undergraduate degree, it was so hard, so much harder than that. No, I'm kidding. I have no idea. It seemed hard at the time, but I know there's other things that are challenging today as well. But of course, everything was harder for millennials. Gen Z is a bunch of whiners. No, I'm kidding. I'm 100% kidding about that. Gen Z faces some truly challenging things in the world. Okay, 43 minutes in. Let's switch over. I don't want to restart now. Nothing good can come of this. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure everything looks good. Okay. Oops, wrong thing. Okay. So, here we are again. We're going to talk about families. So, I've got this unit kind of split into 3 different sections. And it, kind of reflects some of the stuff I'm interested in. So you're welcome, or I'm sorry. I don't know which, right? With professors, sometimes it's like, are my interests so odd and kind of that students will find them super interesting or not? I don't know. But I've got it split into basically 3 sections. So one of them is we're going to talk about marriage. And specifically, the changes in how young people see marriage, right? And what they expect in entering marriage compared to older generations. And we've touched on this a little bit. We're going to definitely dig deeper into it. Okay. The second one, broadly, is we're going to talk about, to put it in crude terms, fertility. So basically kids, right? And again, kind of really simply what's going on is we've seen, really since 2008, just an absolute drop off in fertility. And it's roughly global, which is really, really confusing because that typically doesn't happen. We're going to talk about why, and I will present you with what I think is an interesting theory to explain the decline in fertility at a kind of global level. And then for the third part, so this is really 3 units all blended into one. You're welcome, and I'm sorry. And we're going to talk about family structure. And life outcomes. Because when it comes to kind of the life outcomes of the kids who live in different family structures, not all family structures are equal, certainly. Okay. Excuse me. Oh, I left a Kleenex box here last time and it's not here anymore. But someone just moved it over here. The fiends. Okay, so I always like to start off on this little kind of quote and these things when we talk about kind of families in general. And I do think it's interesting, and I almost, feel more like I should move this into talking about religion, but it doesn't really fit there with what I want to talk about. This is out of a book, Jonathan Haidt, and obviously I'm a fan because we're going to hear about him lots as we get towards the end of the course. Wrote this. He's written a couple of books that I really enjoy. His most recent one, The Anxious Generation, really interesting. The one before that, which was The Coddling of the American Mind, very interesting, and I've referenced it already. This one is more about, he calls it The Righteous Mind, sort of his exploration of what are good systems of thought that make for lives that turn out really well. And just when it comes to families, I always think this is really interesting. That success, and what he says is successful religions made groups more successful at turning resources into offspring, right? And what he suggests is, and this becomes relevant for us because this is largely our society, societies that forego the exoskeleton of religion should reflect carefully on what happens to them over several generations. We don't really know because the first atheistic societies have only emerged in Europe in the last few decades. And, here, maybe I'll put this in red. I don't know why. They are the least efficient societies ever known at turning resources, of which they have a lot, into offspring, which they have few. And here, I always found this, I like this quote because I hate this person. Seth Rogen, I've never found him funny, and I never will. I don't know why he was a star at one point, if he still is. And if you like him, I'm sorry. I've never found him amusing in the slightest. I think at the time where I saw him on The Daily Show or on Stephen Colbert's old show, and he was like, yeah, nobody should go to nobody should even finish high school. Everybody should just drop out and follow their own path. And I'm like, Seth, that worked out really well for you. It doesn't work out particularly well for most people who try that. Okay, and this is him and his partner, right? And they say, that they are fucking psyched all the time. Wait, my subtitles turned off. I only noticed because I want to see if it would copy my swear, which obviously didn't. We're effing psyched all the time. We're laying in bed on Saturday morning, smoking weed, watching movies naked. If we had kids, we could not be doing that, right? And that's, Seth Rogen's idea of the good life. Take that for what you want, right? Maybe that to you, smoking weed and watching movies naked sounds great to you. I don't know why, but for me, it doesn't sound so great. Oh, I want to tell you one thing before we start on this. I was reading an article the other day, and they were talking about South Korea. And just because we'll get to fertility in a little bit, but I like sharing this, when we talk about this quote. So South Korea, depends on what year you're looking at, but they have a total fertility rate, right, which is children per woman, of somewhere between 0.63, that was a couple of years ago, and they managed to raise it massively last year to 0.83. Okay, and then someone did the math, and I've been meaning to do the math for a long time because I think it's interesting. So if we take this fertility, right, or somewhere in the middle of these two numbers, and you cast that out basically 3 generations, right? So if you have a group of 100 people with a fertility of roughly 0.7, I think the person was British, so I'll say not 0.7 or 0.7, right? By the time, so basically what you'll get is somewhere around 44 children, somewhere around 21 grandchildren, and by the time you hit great-grandchildren, you'll have 6 great-grandchildren out of that group of 100. So this is a decline of population of somewhere in the range of about 94%, which means, kind of low fertility in a place like South Korea today is more devastating than any plague or on population than any plague or war in human history. So that I think is really interesting, right? 94% down, right? Negative. So that's, I think, really interesting. And especially when we get to fertility, this is why what you're going to see, and again, I hope to tell you tomorrow's news today, 10, 15, 20 years out, fertility is going to become a major concern globally. And what you're going to see is a lot of efforts by countries all over the world to increase fertility rates. That probably has the most impact on women because it's most likely to curtail their kind of ambitions in life. All right. But first, before we talk about fertility, we're going to talk about marriage. Now, I'm taking a lot of this. So this is Mark Regnerus. Mark's another guy I'm a big fan of for lots of reasons. Mark's a really interesting sociologist. Um, he's quite heterodox, which means he doesn't often, I think, follow a lot of consensus sociological positions. It's gotten him into some really severe trouble. He says stuff that's really, really unpopular and really rubs people the wrong way. And I love him because, as my personality goes, I really, really like heterodox sociologists. Almost all of my favorites are people who rub people the wrong way in major ways, right? And if you've taken my Source of Religion class, you'll know I love Rodney Stark, and Stark was like the number one. Regnerus is like this as well. Okay, so he wrote this book a few years ago called The Future of Christian Marriage. Now, for our purposes, the Christian part doesn't really matter that much, but he has some really interesting things in the first couple chapters where he's setting up the argument about Christian marriage specifically that tell us a lot, I think, about millennials and early Gen Z in how they're kind of navigating the question of marriage. Okay, so really straightforwardly, what Regnerus says is that marriage has a couple of different components, right? In the modern world. So one, you have religious marriages, right? So marriage is done in a church, synagogue, mosque, temple, Gurdwara, etc., right? So that are organized and kind of officiated by religious figures. And civil marriages, right? Basically, civil marriages where a justice of the peace, or you go down to the courthouse, whatever the local kind of legal stipulation is, you're married essentially by an agent of the state. Now, most people treat these things as interchangeable, right? Whether you're married, in a church, or whether you're married, in, I'm trying to think, skydiving, right before you jump out of an airplane, right? The efficient, who got their certificate online so that they could perform marriages, marries you, and then you jump out of a plane, right? Or underwater or on a beach, who cares, right? People basically treat these things as completely interchangeable. Why did I pick only the most absurd ways of getting married? I don't know. I had one friend, and they wanted to get married. They had this favorite hiking trail, and they wanted to get married like at the base of this glacier. And they asked their whole like wedding party and all their friends to like hike a day to attend their wedding. And I was like, yeah, no. I mean, my wife was also like 6 months pregnant at the time, and I was like, yeah, so we're not going to do that. Maybe that's why I'm like, people choose funny things. Okay. Now, marriage hasn't changed a whole lot, right? From sort of, really industrialization on to today. Its purpose is really, and the way people, sort of understand it, is all of these things, right? It's organized for the care of children that come out of the marriage, and most people who do get married assume that children will come out of it. To manage the ownership and inheritance of property in a cleaner way, because the law is set up largely around marriage, and legal rights to act on behalf of an incapacitated spouse, right? And if you're probably all too young for this, but if you remember a lot of the debates around, allowing same-sex people to marry, a lot of the arguments were around, particularly these bottom 2 points, where people had been denied inheritance, or the ability to act on, as a proxy for their partner in a medical situation, right? Okay. And it's still fairly popular, right? According to the American Political and Social Behavior Survey, about 2/3 of Americans disagreed with the opinion, either strongly or just disagreed, that marriage is an outdated institution. Now, of course, that still means that 1/3 did agree that it was an outdated institution, but, still 2/3 is not bad. Okay, now, for all of its continuity, marriage has obviously changed, and Regnerus admits this, right? So, views on the definition of marriage haven't really changed, but the breakdown of marriages has certainly increased, right? And especially Is it 1963? Can't remember the year. 1963, I think, and 1985 are sort of key years here. And these are expansions of divorce rights, and especially 1985 and thereabouts, different jurisdictions, slightly different dates, where no-fault divorce became sort of the central law. The roles of the partners in marriages has changed, right? Marriage remains an overwhelmingly heterosexual institution, but within it, right, the responsibilities of husbands and wives and the kind of gender distribution has changed, particularly towards, a rebalancement of sex roles, right? Moving some of the responsibilities domestically off of women and onto men, and a change in kind of arrangements around child care and child rearing as well. And yeah, the legal definition has been altered to include more people, right? And here, particularly same-sex couples, right, have been included in the definitions. And obviously that happened in Canada a bit earlier. I think it happened in Canada about 2005, and it wasn't until 2015 that it happened in the US. Okay, so Regnerus takes an argument, though, in terms of what one of the biggest changes to marriage and what's happened from another sociologist. I don't want to highlight in red. Too aggressive. Named Andrew Cherlin, right? And what Cherlin argued and what Regnerus then articulates in his book is that marriage today is widely perceived as a capstone rather than as a foundation, right? And the difference here is actually pretty profound in terms of how people behave. So a capstone, right? What is a capstone? A capstone is the finishing touch of a structure, right? So it's the last thing you do. Once the structure is built, you put the capstone on as a sort of decorative thing, right? Whereas a foundation is essential, right? A foundation is the thing that you build everything else off of, right? So what's really happened is we've moved from this standard historically to this one, right? So where it used to be that, if you're thinking of adult life, building an adult life, if we went back, to the Greatest Generation, the Silence, and beyond, right, older generations, marriage was almost universally, and for most of human history, seen as a foundation, right? You were going to build your adult life on the foundation that marriage created, right? And the family unit that it created. It was essential. We've moved to this, right? Where it is now, you build your adult life, right? The foundation of your adult life is something different. Often now we're thinking the foundation of adult life is education and career, and marriage is that last little piece that you add once those other pieces are put into place. Okay. I like this quote, so I'm going to highlight some stuff. This is, Regnerus, page 38. When people are building their lives, marriage is widely understood today as an achievement attained by each, not the beginning of constructing an adult life, right? So really, we've just overturned basically how people understood it for most of history, and we've gone to a completely different standard. And yeah, oops, I missed that typo. I thought I went through and fixed all my typos. So most no longer think of marriage as a formative institution, right? But rather as an institution they enter once they're fully formed, right? And this is broadly shared between religious and non-religious people. One of the things that Regnerus points out in the book, and where I appreciate the insight, is that we sometimes think that religious people might have slightly different views when it comes to this, but for the most part, religious people, and he does this survey globally, seem to have roughly the same attitudes as their non-religious peers, right? So this is a kind of transformation and understanding of marriage that has broadly affected most of society. Okay, and here I have my fun little, this is from the book. I didn't make this, so I can't take credit, but, so what is a capstone, right? It's a symbol of a successful development. So you get married to show that you've kind of made it. It's something you build towards, and what happens, right? When you have a capstone model, You have fewer marriages, later marriages, and an emphasis on psychological satisfaction. And here, right, in a foundation model, earlier marriages, more marriages, emphasis on practical importance, right? So the way, a couple can support each other, and, a building of complementary strengths to help accomplish goals, especially those goals of building an adult life. Okay. So, again, I like this book. There's lots of fun quotes. We now get ourselves ready for marriage rather than marry to get ourselves poised to accomplish common objectives, a home, family, job. Instead, marriage, okay. Again, I thought I fixed all my typos. Has now become one of those objectives, right? There we go. Marriage as a capstone to a successful young adulthood today is considered a safety mechanism, right? So basically, rather than getting into a long-term relationship when neither person is 100% set, you set it as this capstone to an adult life, so that what you're getting is two people who are already secure, who have already achieved a lot of their goals, then coming together, right? And so, again, this is right from the book. The spouses in a capstone model are supposed to be independent of each other rather than encouraging dependence. And these are two adults that don't need each other, right? They simply want each other. Okay. Again, none of this is either good or bad in a sense. This is just a description of what has happened. Okay. So, along with this, what has happened is that marriage has changed from a populist institution, right? One that was broadly distributed amongst the whole population. And we get to the last unit in this, or the last part of this unit, right? When we talk about Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege, there's some really interesting ways that this sort of has played out, right? But broadly, marriage is now something that increasingly is a luxury institution, right? You're seeing it in the middle and upper classes. You're not seeing it in the working class and poor, right? Because, it serves primarily the ones who have made it. And it remains a really powerful and really efficient social institution, for things like raising children, increasing wealth, all of those things, right? Marriage is still really powerful that way, but it's now the purview increasingly of those who already have those things. Owning a car, having some savings has become the way to cross a symbolic boundary and qualify for marriage, right? To qualify for marriage, you have to have achieved certain things. And most people, right, there still is a broadly shared desire for people who still mostly want to get married, but only some people can actually afford it. Marriage, not cohabitation, typically requires, economic and residential independence, right? Which boils down to having enough money, right? So you can cohabit with someone, right? So you can live with someone before you're set. But to qualify to get married as on a cultural level, typically both people have to have hit a certain level of affluence. Okay. And this is, I think, a really bold statement, but I think a really interesting one as well. Oops, I wanted my highlighter. This quote from Regnerus, page 39 of the book. He says, we're seeing growing inequality in the West. I think that's unquestioned. Prompted in part, and he says, by the marital divide between rich and poor. I wanted a different color here. The advantaged, right, so the middle class and upper classes, consolidate their wealth and income by a marriage between two successful people, while the disadvantaged are left without even the help of each other. And what he says here, the capstone vision has unwittingly turned marriage into an unaffordable luxury good. And he says, and I like this because it's a bold statement. I like bold statements. It might sound outlandish, but it's not. He says marriage is not a social justice issue. It's the social justice issue. Oh, I did that in yellow so you can't see it. Okay. The social justice issue of our time, right? He thinks of it as the dividing line between rich and poor in our society, increasingly tracks along the lines of marriage. And again, we'll see an economic, I could have blended these two things together, but I chose to keep them separate. When we look at Melissa Kearney's argument about family structure, and again, her book is called The Two-Parent Privilege. Wow, they spelled Kearney right? I'm impressed. Not an easy name to spell right. She'll lay out in a lot of detail what this looks like, right? What marriage does in terms of, the income of parents, stability, and life outcomes for children. There are really, there's really a lot of interesting stuff there. Okay, but we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, now, is there an ideal age to marry? The quick answer to that is no. No, my O is slightly out of line. No, there isn't necessarily an ideal one. People are different. If you want to look just at like flat statistics, people have put the age kind of ideally between about 24 and 28. Like that's where, if you get married in this range, marriages are more likely to be successful. Now, not surprisingly, of American men 18 to 20, bless you, who got married, almost half were divorced 5 years later, right? So 18 to 20 is really, really young to get married, right? So no surprise that being too young and a little bit too immature makes you a bad marriage partner in some cases, right? So they are less likely to have reached emotional maturity, right? Probably less likely to select a reliably committed partner, right? Or mate, that's the word he uses in the book, right? The choices that 18 to 20-year-olds make about partners on the whole are more likely to be, male ones particularly, are more likely to be driven by attractiveness, right? And attractiveness is important as a quality, but it doesn't being attractive doesn't necessarily make you a great partner. And yeah, they're less likely to understand how to sacrifice and I think communicate and solve problems within a relationship, right? Because they haven't had that life experience. Okay. So what typically will make for marriages that are particularly stable? Well, time to launch a career and at least acquire some financial assets seems to be important, right? Being able to support yourselves. Financial struggles are the number one driver of divorce, so that is important. Time to mature, right? So sort of figuring yourself out and learning how to navigate relationships, but not too much. And this is, maybe slightly paradoxically, the further you get away from the top end of this bracket, right? 28 and above, the more likely it is you are to be sort of, how to put this, rigid, right? Rigidity, right? Inability to compromise things that are important to you in order to, accommodate a partner and living with that person, right? Now, it's not to say if you get married at 29 or 30 or 31, you're doomed, right? Certainly not. It's just like on average, the older you get and the longer you've lived on your own, the harder it's going to be to then accommodate someone into the life that you've built, right? You get certain habits and patterns, and those get harder to break as you get older. Okay. And the other one, there is a kind of concern around reproduction, right? We sometimes refer to this as a woman's biological clock or age-related fertility concerns, right? So, how to put this? If you want to have a child, right, and you're a woman, kind of your, peak fertility. We'll say peak fertility. It's a nice scientific way of saying it. Is between the ages of 15 and 28, right? Afterwards, the further you get away from this range, the harder it's going to be to have a child, right? Now, what's happened in most Western societies is the age, like most people want to wait to have children until they're married, right? As the age at first marriage has increased, the age at which people are trying to have children gets further and further away from that sort of, optimal from a biological perspective time. And so what happens is it gets harder and harder for women to get pregnant, which is why we've seen such an increase in demand for things like, in vitro fertilization, other fertility technologies, surrogacy, and all of those things, right? Because people are getting married later, they're putting off childbearing for longer, and it gets harder and harder to have children after that time. So in terms of marriage, right, if there's an optimal time, it's probably, if you want to have children, kind of within the window where it's easiest to do so. Okay. Wait, I haven't seen a question slide in a bit. Do I have none in here? Oh, here's one. Thankfully, there were no questions. Good times. Oh, I know. So many slides. Okay. Now, as an objection, right? Some people have suggested, and some demographers and sociologists have suggested that really what we're seeing is not so much fewer marriages, but it's what's called a tempo effect, right? So, I mean, if you remember back when we were talking about our generations, right, we talked about, we had our fast and our slow life plans, right? And increasingly, and most of you on your midterms identified this, right, that Gen X, millennials, Gen Z have moved to a much slower life plan, right? So, it's taking longer to get educated, to get all of those things that you need for adulthood. So what happens then? Well, at the end of the day, it just takes longer to hit certain milestones. So some demographers and sociologists have suggested that it's not that you're going to get less marriages, they're just going to be delayed and a little bit later in life. Regnerus kind of counters this by saying, look, yes, there's going to be some delay, but what potentially happens, and what the statistics show, is that for every 1 year increase in the average age at first marriage, right? So we take the average of the population, the age at first marriage, for every year that it goes up, the rate of Europeans between 25 and 44 that have ever been married decreases by 3.44%. And again, this is outside of what Regnerus says, right? So in South America, right, it actually increases by 5.24%. So it's even bigger in South America, right? So different parts of the world, slightly different outcomes. And there's some regional variations. I think he says in the book that if you look at the Czech Republic, right, each year of delay of first marriage in the Czech Republic increases it by 6.8%, right? So there's regional differentiations here that I think are meaningful. Oh, yeah, please.
Did it increase or decrease?
Oh, it decreases. Yeah. So every increase in the age at first marriage decreases the ever married rate in 25 to 44, right? So yeah. Okay. Now, I had a thought. I now forget what my thought was. Oh, there are some demographers now that are estimating that by the time we get to 2035, so that's really about a decade away, roughly, so about half of women in the, now this is a little bit higher, the 35 to 50 range will have never been married, right? So that's an estimate, if all things remain as they are, in 2035, it's going to be half of all women who will have never been married, right? And again, neither good or bad, just a statistical sort of reality. Now, what is potentially possible here, oops, I didn't mean to erase everything, but I did. Sorry about that. What this does open up is what is sometimes called a low fertility trap, right? Now, what is a low fertility trap? So this is a term from demography, and essentially, how to put this in really simple terms. A low fertility trap is when you create conditions in a society that essentially sort of bake in low fertility, right? Where what can happen is fewer people have children, right? And the society itself then sort of organizes itself around sort of social systems of organization that are less friendly to children, right? And it actually makes it harder for people to have more children, right? So some of this, especially when we talk about demography, some of this at a certain point gains a sort of logic of its own and becomes really, really hard to reverse. And I'll give you like some really kind of straightforward examples of what this looks like. So if people get married later, what happens? They're going to tend to have fewer children, right? Because it's harder to get pregnant, and as you get older, right, it's much harder to raise a child, right? They demand so much energy, and how old was I when we had my daughter, who's now 16, 28, 27, 28. Way easier to keep up with a toddler at in your 20s. By the time we had my third son, who's now 6, right? So I was 37. Way harder to keep up with him, and it continues to be because he's just a ball of energy, right? So what tends to happen, people will have fewer children if they get married later. That fertility window is shorter. It's harder to have children, right? Chances of infertility grow as you get fewer children. What can then happen is the whole society sort of starts to be designed around fewer children. So, for instance, the number of bedrooms in the average house has been declining, right? Today, almost all new family homes built are built around, basically 4-person families. But we're seeing more houses now built around 3-person families, right? Which, let's say that you want to have 3 kids, right? Or 4 kids, right? That's your goal in life, right? So now you would have a 6-person family in a home designed essentially for 4 people. So you're going to have kids sharing a bedroom, right? Okay, not a big deal, like technically possible, but definitely more of a challenge, right? Other things, and this is something that Louise Perry, who's a British kind of social commentator, noted, which I thought was really interesting. She has a couple of young kids, and she noted that in London, the buses have more seating for the elderly than for, what does she call them? Oh, what do they have such beautiful prams or baby carriages, right? So there's more space for the elderly and less space for baby carriages, right? So getting around on London's public transit was easier for old people. The society starts to be catered around old people. Okay, other examples. One of the things that South Korea, I love South Korea. Such an interesting society. So sad that it'll be gone in 100 years. Just fade away completely. There'll be like 4 South Koreans left. It'll be weird. Okay, not technically true. But, again, if nothing changes in South Korea, their population within about 100 years is going to drop like 94%, which is, a thing. Okay, so South Korea. One of the things that South Korea, it's been noted, is an increase, so as there are fewer children, it's not that the people who don't have children find your children super precious and wonderful and just want to be around them all the time. They actually tend to find your children annoying. So what's kind of happened is, what we've seen in South Korea is an increase in the number of adult-only spaces. So more restaurants banning children altogether, right? No children at this restaurant, which makes the society itself less friendly to children, which sort of creates a social pressure. Like if you still want to be involved, you want to go to the nice restaurants, having children becomes more of a challenge, right? And I love this anecdote, and I think this comes from Louise Perry. I now can't remember. There was someone talking to an international student from South Korea, and they'd come over, and basically one of the people they knew, one of the other students this international student was talking to, their sister had a baby, and so she was describing, what goes into a baby shower. And described it, and then asked this person from South Korea, well, what do people do in South Korea when someone has a baby? And the response was, I have no idea. No one I know has had a baby, right? Again, that's your low fertility trap. The physical spaces become less friendly. Culture pushes people to have less children, and it then becomes really difficult to increase fertility. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about fertility in the next part of this unit. Because there's very few social or cultural or economic interventions that have actually worked in increasing fertility. Just not very many. Okay. I want to take a pause. I'm out of breath and I need more tea. Let's take a pause. Let's take 20 minutes. Let's come back at 41 or 42, and we'll kind of go from there. I'm tapped. Okay, let's restart here. I know people were asking about the tea. Went back to the good old hibiscus tea from the break room. I don't know where it came from, but it tastes pretty good. Okay, so marriage. We're talking about marriage. Good times. So what's the new normal, right? When we're talking about kind of norms around marriage, one of the things that's clear to Rigneris is that both men and women, right? So both of them are expected to bring more resources into marriage, right? If you can't sustain kind of a certain lifestyle, you're not considered marriageable. And this ends up becoming, I think, a really interesting and really important word, right? And we'll see it lots of times, and I'll talk about it fairly frequently through the course and just kind of use it. Marriageable, right? So basically, to be marriageable is to be someone who is considered worth marrying, right? To have all of those qualities that make you, potentially a good partner for someone of the opposite sex. Okay, so now those higher lifestyle demands, right? They do apply to both, but increasingly for men, one of the sort of marriageable factors is whether, as a man, you'll be able to sustain your partner's lifestyle. Oops, I picked an eraser, not a highlighter. Silly me. Sustain a partner's lifestyle, especially once children potentially enter the equation, right? So if you're going to be marriageable, one of the things that, is going to determine your marriageability if you're male is whether, once you get married and if you have kids, will that decrease your partner's lifestyle, right? Are you going to have to make cuts and sacrifices, or can you maintain, right, whatever the lifestyle you expect is going to be? And I love this quote. I have a longer version of it on another slide. But in the capstone standard, being poor is a sign that there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material, right? Now, what Rigneris suggests is that overall, this has been devastating for the poor and working class, right? They would benefit a lot from the combination of assets and the general stability that comes from marriage. And one of the things that Kearney notes when and again, we'll get to her, one of the things that she notes that I think is really interesting is that marriage, divorce is possible. Divorce is a sort of friction, right? It's really, going through the process of divorce is hard. And so a lot of people will choose to stay together and work things out rather than get divorced because, that process is ugly and messy and expensive. That friction creates a sort of stability, right? Cohabitation doesn't have that kind of stability, right? It's relatively easy to end a cohabiting relationship, which leads to them being somewhat more unstable. Okay. Now, so there are high material and psychological expectations that accompany the capstone marriage model of marriage, right? The psychological ones are that this person's going to fulfill you, right? They're going to be your soulmate. They're going to be your everything, right? That is a big part of capstone marriage. Now, a foundational model, or the foundation model, would consider marriage as a way to reach the goals of financial stability and other shared goals. Capstone marriage is a prize for having achieved that stability on your own. Okay. So, interesting kind of things. Some of the challenges, right? Well, one of them, and again, it goes to this kind of general struggle that men, especially younger men, have been having for a long time, which we're going to, again, develop as we go through the rest of the course. But men are just not doing as well as they used to, right? Between 1996 and 2016, in the US, men in this kind of prime working age group, 25 to 34, basically saw a huge increase in their labor force non-participation, right? So it roughly, not quite doubled, but it roughly doubled, right? The rate grew from basically 6.4% of prime working age men out of the labor force, 6.7, up to 11.3%, right? So now of that kind of really youngest cohort of men we expect to be completely out of the education market and into those early working years, almost 1 in 10, or a little bit more than 1 in 10 by 2016, had basically were outside the labor market. And that number has actually just continued to increase. Okay. The other thing that has happened is what Elizabeth Warren. So I don't know if you know who Elizabeth Warren is. Elizabeth Warren is a Democratic U.S. Senator, right, from the state of Massachusetts. But before she was a U.S. Senator, she was a professor at Harvard Law. And she wrote a really, I think, interesting book called the Two Income Trap. And what it basically described was that increasingly the way like late modern societies are organized is in such a way that, having two incomes in a household, so usually both, say, husband and wife or two partners working, was not only desirable but actually necessary, right? That you couldn't make ends meet without it. Now, the causes of this are super complex, and she goes through it in the book. Amongst other things, right? Super low interest rates raised real estate prices, allowed people to, especially affluent people, to sort of outbid each other in, the real estate market, especially she thinks to get into really good and competitive school districts. In the US, this matters a little bit more because that allowed people to, say, get into the top colleges. In the US, there's a way more kind of stratified US college system than we have here in Canada. But Canada is not too different, right? In the sense that if you want to own a decent home in a decent neighborhood, you're going to be paying, okay, if you're in Vancouver, who knows, like $1.2 million, but even in Edmonton, right, you're probably looking at, like, for something at the base level, $350,000, but for something, really nice and a little bit more desirable, you're up into the $500,000-$600,000 range. Making those mortgage payments, requires two incomes. So whether or not, both adults want to work, it becomes sort of inevitable that they have to work, right? Or significant lifestyle cuts need to happen, right? And most people are simply unwilling to make those lifestyle cuts, right? They're not going to not travel to Mexico every couple of years for a tropical vacation, drive really old cars, right? Most people are simply not willing to make those kinds of sacrifices because lifestyle is seen as very important. Okay. So we're in a kind of two income trap, right? Both adults need to work to sustain lifestyles, make payments on expensive property, and all of those things. And a lot of people actually would prefer that this not be the case. Maybe that's where trad wife culture comes from. I don't know. But it seems to be increasingly necessary. Okay. So why aren't we seeing more marriages, right? Because in theory, right, in terms of lifestyle, two incomes should be better than one, right? Better to maintain your lifestyle if you have two married partners. And, combining your costs definitely is helpful. Plus, basically all of the sociological and health evidence, public health evidence suggests that marriage is pretty good for you, right? A little bit better for you if you're male, but also good for you if you're female. Married people tend to have better psychological and physical health than their unmarried counterparts. Okay, so one of the things that Regnerus suggests seems to be holding things back is a sort of cultural standard, right? And this cultural standard in particular is that the initiation of marriage, right? So the marriage proposal still seems to be largely something that, men are required to do, right? So it's still mostly men who are required to ask for marriage, but increasingly they don't want to, right? A lot of men are putting off or avoiding asking someone to marry them for a long time. And if you want to see how kind of like dominant this is on a very anecdotal level, just like Google marriage proposal and look at the Google images, right? It's almost always some version of this, right? There are certainly exceptions, but it's always going to be something like, man down on one knee with box with overpriced shiny rock on overpriced metal band. All right, that's almost always what you're going to find if you're looking on Google Images. And again, I know people will do this live in class and be like, I found one. And it's like, yeah, you found one. But it's mostly this, right? Okay. Whew, still very hot. So the current model of marriage Regnerus also refers to as what he calls the suffocation model of marriage. And largely it's kind of suffocating because the material expectations and the kind of psychological, emotional expectations on both partners are extremely high, right? Okay, so those material expectations are really high, right? High, lifestyle, eating out, traveling, all of these things are expected to remain. This one, right? Marriage is also seen as a vehicle of self-actualization, right? Rather than self-sacrifice. And maybe I don't want to get ahead of myself or get over my own skis here a little bit, but this is part of a broader cultural shift that's been going on really, I think, since the 1960s. The psychologist, Philip Reef, wrote a book about this called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. I should have probably just told you and not written it out. That's okay. Okay, so The Triumph of the Therapeutic. We'll talk about this again later. We talk about religion. Increasingly, right, therapy culture and therapeutic language has come to dominate virtually every aspect of life, especially in developed societies. And marriage is no different, right? Marriage is supposed to make you happy, right? It's supposed to make you feel fulfilled. It's supposed to make you into your better self or discover something, right? Whether it can actually achieve those things is a different question altogether, but that's the expectation that people bring into marriage, right? And so they expect that their partner is going to, somehow increase their subjective well-being in major ways. And a lot of marriages, obviously, and a lot of people simply can't live up to this standard, right? So, where self-sacrifice used to be sort of the norm in that foundation model, increasingly self-actualization is what people expect. But obviously marriage, often involves, sort of a little bit of self-sacrifice at least. Okay. And yeah, when we talk to young people, and Rigneris and his team did this with young people from all over the globe, right? From the whole, from societies, the US, Canada, Poland, I think they went to the Czech Republic, Mexico, I think Argentina, there's Nigeria, right? So they talk to people, Russia, they talk to people from all over the place. And broadly speaking, right, he says young people, very few young people profess expectations of marriage that are modest, right? They're thinking marriage is going to be spectacular. And their young adults are determined that marriage isn't going to curb their premarital lifestyle, right? And this was true pretty much everywhere. Okay. And this is the longer version of that quote that I had on the other page, right? And I'll highlight a couple of important bits. Men and women have historically responded to temporarily tough times by delaying marriage and childbirth. It's a highlighter. Okay. Delaying marriage and childbearing. What today's couples seem universally uninterested in doing, however, is lowering their material expectations. This too is a sign of the capstone standard's primacy. In the contrasting foundation's vision, being newly married and poor was difficult, expected, and typically temporary. In the capstone standard, being poor is a sign there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material, right? So I think that's interesting. Let's check for questions. I need more question slides. All right, they're all about tea, so who cares? Okay. This is a funny unit. Sometimes people get really mad at me for this one, and there's like a flurry of comments. And other years, it's just nothing. Okay, I don't know why. So, all right, let's talk about what Rigneris suggests is men, money, and the waning motivation to marry. But I want a different pen. There we go. Green. All right, so typically speaking, right, if we look at our typical economic patterns, economic stability has tended to prompt men to pursue marriage. Inevitably, what you would get, and we have lots of natural experiments that suggest this, is that in hard economic times, marriage rates go down. When the economy improves, marriage rates go up. If you get something like an economic boom, right, and these are usually regional, what you'll see is a corresponding increase in marriages in the region that's experiencing an economic boom. Okay, so demographers and economists have long kind of shared basic assumptions that that one of the reasons we've seen declines in marriage is that there's been a decline in economic stability for men, and it should therefore, and that's what's causing our declining marriage rates. And marriage rates have been going down for a long time. Now, three economists, Schneider, Harknett, and Stimson, in their look at the economics data, suggested that economic decline or decline in economic stability probably explains only about a fifth of the drop. The rest of the drop, has to be explained by other factors, largely cultural ones. And yeah, this one's interesting. 2019 study by Lichert, Price, and Swigert asked what economic levels would move women from being unmarried to married. And they estimated, right, based on the data, that men's incomes would have to rise by 55% and their employment rate would have to rise by 26% to move marriage rates significantly higher, right? So what does this mean? And I'll highlight this. In terms of their income and economic prospects, far more men today are now considered unmarriageable to both, careerist, economic, and undereducated working class women, right? So we've seen broad marriage declines across the board because men, in terms of their earning potential, their economic stability, right, are broadly just not there. There's been big declines across the board. Okay. Pen. Now, another factor that probably weighs in here, and here we want to talk. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Right before it happened, the pen did nothing. Culture. We talk about culture, right? So, one of the things that likely is playing a role is marriage market dynamics. So, if we talk about the marriageable portion of the market, right, there's a lot more men struggling, right? Men's economic prospects have generally been either stable or declining since the 1970s, compared to women's economic prospects that have broadly gotten a lot better. And so men are now outnumbered by women in the marriageable portion of the wider mating and relationship market. Now, there's a lot of men who are still out there who aren't marriageable, who are, women would typically look at them and say, yeah, maybe that's I live with that person for a while, but not right away jumping into a serious relationship. Now, what is this? This is a simple kind of economics dynamic. And Regnerus really likes these economic arguments. He isn't, we'll talk about another one later in the course. He has a book called Cheap Sex, which makes a broadly economic argument about sexual relationships, which is interesting as well. But basically, right, you've got a supply and demand problem. You have, limited supply of men. I won't write this down. I'll just speak it, right? So you have a limited supply of men that are marriageable in the marketplace, and there is more demand for those men from the, larger number of women who might be wanting to get married. And so what does this ultimately do? Well, those men, right, have more power and more time to navigate marriage on their own terms, right? So basically what will end up happening in a lot of cases is men will actually string women along. And I have that on another slide. I don't remember where. Okay, it's somewhere. We'll get there. Right, so men have more time, and largely because men's kind of fertility related concerns, though they do exist, the time frame where men can have children is a little bit longer than women. They often will have more time, and that's a less pressing sort of question. Okay, so when we talk about culture, something has happened to men, and there's a really interesting sort of natural experiment that suggests this is the case, right? So the natural assumption amongst economists has been that when you get better economic times, right, you're going to get an increase in marriages, right? More men will feel more economically secure, and they will therefore ask women to marry them. But we have a very interesting sort of relatively recent, what's called a natural experiment that suggests that something in this kind of historic dynamic has changed. So this is what's called, and this, again, we'll talk about Melissa Kearney in a sec. Kearney and her frequent co-author Wilson kind of looked at what's called a natural experiment. So a natural experiment, if you don't remember from SOS 100 or from Intro to Methods, a natural experiment is where something happens out in the world in a relatively isolated population, where you can then sort of take statistical data and treat that as though, an experiment has happened, and you can compare that group to the wider society or to other historical periods. And one of the really interesting recent natural experiments came out of North Dakota, right? So starting in 2006 and roughly ending about 6 years later, in North Dakota, you had a boom in fracking, right? So fracking is this process of extracting oil and gas from shale, where basically, you take high pressure water and chemicals and use it to crack the shale that's deep underground. And there's oil and there is, natural gas contained within that shale. And then you basically use that liquid that you pumped in to force that oil and gas back up through a well, and you collect it. And this is a technology that really sort of hit its peak right in around here, right? Basically, because oil was so expensive, it made this relatively expensive way of getting oil and gas out of the ground really, really profitable. And one of the places that has a ton of really easily accessible shale is North Dakota. Now, North Dakota, prior to this, not known for its economic dynamism. It's a pretty depressed part of the United States, right, with poor job prospects for men in particular. But what happens is all of a sudden you get a fracking boom, right? And all of a sudden, lots of men find employment in oil and gas. So they get really, really successful. And we're talking, really high demand, pretty dangerous work. So the pay is also really good, right? I guess we all live in Alberta. We know what rig pigs are like, right? These are rig pigs. That's a colloquially very rude way of describing these people. Nothing wrong with what they do, but rig workers, right? Let's say rig workers. It's nicer. Rig workers, right? They make lots of money. So you get a big boom in demand for principally male labor and men's, you get men who suddenly go from having poor economic prospects to really, really good economic prospects, salaries well into the six figures, right? And all of that. Now, the expectation should be, and obviously you've probably read the slide by now, that this would increase marriage rates. It did not, right? Marriage rates did not move. It did raise birth rates, right? So birth rates for both married and unmarried women both increased, right? So obviously people had more children during this point, but marriage rates didn't move. And this contrasts, to basically things that we've seen in similar communities in the past. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a similar natural resources boom in Appalachia, right? So in like Ohio, Kentucky, in the mountains where they had a significant coal boom, which again increased the wages of a lot of working class men. And in that case, did lead to a huge surge in marriages. So Rigneris asks, what's changed? Do men no longer want to get married? And I think the answer here is largely, it seems that way, right? Or if so, they're in no particular hurry to do it. And then the question becomes, why? Which we'll endeavor to answer here. Okay, so other things that Rigneris cites, Dorn and Hansen's 2018 study that found, amongst other things, declines in male-dominated industries do in fact apparently deter the formation of marriages in America. But weirdly, actually not weirdly, it actually makes perfect sense, declines in more female-intensive occupations have the opposite effect. So when men struggle economically, marriage rates decline. When women struggle economically, marriage rates increase, right? Marriage rates decline generally when the likelihood of a woman out-earning men rises, right? So if women are making more money than men, generally, that makes men appear unmarriageable to them, right? Okay. So other things. All right, so what's going on? Well, here's an interesting quote from the book, right? So what he says is it's not that, particularly poor and working class women don't like the idea of marriage. In fact, they're actually more apt to say that they do like the idea of marriage than their middle and upper class kind of cohort. But, and I like this part, they simply do not see how the men in their lives will live up to it, right? So they might like to get married, but they generally think that the men that are around them are kind of worthless, right? Um, I put it that way kindly, right? That they're not going to be able to live up to those standards. So what do? They hedge their bets, waiting, cohabiting, having children, with few great expectations of a lifelong mate. Right, and the quote goes on. This is even more tragic for those communities than it first appears when a children's parents aren't married. Even if they are living together, that child is automatically at increased risk for a bunch of negative outcomes like drug use, delinquent behavior, domestic violence, and parental breakup. And add to that just life in poverty, and he says it's no surprise that the cycle continues. Okay. Pen time. So, what do people expect out of marriage generally? Well, widely in polls, and we see this across the globe, these are sort of the four things that people expect out of marriage, right? So, they think it is a comprehensive union, right? So, what does that mean? Well, basically, you're not going to hold anything back, right? It doesn't mean, each person gets their own money. It's a sharing of resources and a sharing of goals, right? People expect to work together. Children, most couples who marry expect to have children, right? Despite the, increasing prevalence of child-free people and that as a sort of cultural artifact, it's still widely expected. You get married, you'll have kids. Most people expect marriage to be permanent. No one ever thinks they're the one that's going to get divorced, right? Despite the statistics, everyone always thinks they're going to beat the odds. But so people, this is funny, nobody ever looks at odds. I think we should teach statistics better in high school. Most people don't beat the odds, but everybody thinks they're going to be the one who beats the odds. If people didn't think this, online gambling sites would fail tomorrow. And no one would ever buy a lottery ticket because everyone would realize that it's completely pointless. But people always think, well, I'm the one who's going to beat the odds, right? Because we're bad at statistics and averages. So people expect it to be permanent, despite what they hear, right? They're the ones that are going to beat it because they're just so in love or whatever. And fidelity, right? So sexual fidelity within marriage continues to be an expected cultural norm. And even, I like this part, even infidelity, even if agreed upon, carries with it an expiration date, right? So again, sometimes you'll hear these sort of stories of like polycules and polyamory and open marriages, right? Of people, saying like, oh yeah, we can see other people, but we'll stay married. That lasts typically for a little bit until it doesn't work. And then it tends to end in divorce anyway, right? Probably would have been better just to go with that at the beginning. Okay. All tea-related questions. Okay, so here's the why, right? We start to get here into the why question. Why is marriage potentially declining? And Rigneris, and again, he wrote a whole book on this, and I'll talk about this when we talk about sex and intimacy a little bit. But basically, what Rigneris suggests is that there's been a fundamental shift in what sex requires from men, right? Like what getting sex requires from men, right? So if we want to put kind of human relationships into economic terms, economically speaking, Rigneris says women have what men want. And not to be like too subtle, right? But that's what the picture on the slide is about. Right? Men want sex, right? They want access to women's bodies. It's, pretty primal evolutionary drive. Men want, access to women's bodies. And historically, what this has involved is giving something in exchange, right, for gaining access to a sexual partner, right? Most typically promises or commitments, right? So marriage, the promise that you're going to stick around, that you're going to be financially bound to this other person, right? And this was important to women, especially, prior to birth control, when sex, generally, if you were having sex for long enough, it generally involved getting pregnant and having children, because there was really no way to avoid that, right? Okay, so what Regnerus says is in the past, sex was relatively expensive for men, right? They had to give up a lot in order to get reliable access to sex, right? They had to really, tie themselves down, if you will, though I hate that language. That's the language of the old ball and chain, but I guess that's sort of the logic that goes in here. Okay, now, what's happened, really since the sexual revolution, according to Regnerus, is that sex has become cheap, right? And he says sex is cheap if women expect little from men in return for sex, right? Where it's relatively easy to get sex for men, sex becomes cheap. So if it's easy, it's cheap. And this, he says, would include access to pornography, right? Which is really, really cheap by kind of, the standards of it, right? What do you need to give up to get, sexual gratification from pornography? Really nothing, right? Most of it is free. Some of it costs a little bit if you get into like, OnlyFans or something like that. But generally speaking, right, it is now so cheap that it basically costs nothing. And what Regnerus suggests, and this is, sort of the thesis of part of his other book, Cheap Sex, obviously, is that the increased kind of access for cheap sort of drains a lot of the motivation to form long-term relationships out of men. Not saying they will never get there, but that it allows them to delay it for a lot longer. So it's actually kind of, how shall we say, if you think marriage formation is important, it definitely makes it harder. Even if you're just interested in the question of what has changed, this seems to be one of the big ones. Okay, so how cheap sex slows marriage. Okay, so what Regnerus says, and again, I think this is pretty inarguable. For the most part, right, if you take kind of averages, men tend to express greater interest in sexual variety than women do, right? So if you have if available, more men will take advantage of more access to more sexual partners. Okay, now, again, marriage-minded women, I said this before, tend to outnumber marriage-minded men. So what happens is it becomes harder for women to demand commitment from men. Why? Well, because it's relatively easy for the I want to call them alphas because I think that language is stupid. But let's say, your most marriageable men, right? Those who have the best career prospects, already have good jobs, already have good finances, maybe have own property, right? Those that are, or at least it looks like they're going to trend in that direction, they have a lot of power in the kind of mating and, sexual relationship market, right? So they tend to be able to do a bunch of things. Like one is demand, sex much more quickly than most women typically would want, right? And if they're not getting so they can also delay, right? So they string women along. And it's relatively easy for them, right? Especially if you're in that marriageable part of the market, to move on and find someone else, right? So they will tend to be able to sort of string women along, delay. And, there seems to be this inherent understanding from both people that men tend to have a lot of options and women have fewer of them when it comes to quality men. At least this is what I understand from almost anyone who's been on a dating site in the last 10 years, right? The quality of men, shall we say, is not present. And I've never used a dating site. Just from friends I know who've used them, they're like, yeah, it's not great. Anyway, okay, this is just a quote. I won't read it to you, but you get the sense, right? This is Pavel from Krakow, right, in Poland, right, basically suggesting that, if sex is easy, men will take it and then, string you along to some extent. Okay, now, cohabitation as a modern alternative. I just want to see where I'm at here. Because I've lost my mouse. Where are you, Mousy? Okay, we're almost done with Rignaris, and I think we'll have a good shot of getting through the next part today. Okay, so what does Rignaris suggest about cohabitation? It's increasingly used, we talked about this a little bit earlier, I think. Yes, we did. Sorry, I forget what course I'm in sometimes. I talk about this all the time, and I'm like, what course am I in? I'm in this one. Did I talk about it? Yes. I also finished this course like literally days before this course, in the winter before this course started, so I'm confused about what I've talked about. This is what happens when you teach the same course 3 times in a year. Okay, so cohabitation, right? Increasingly seen as a safety hatch against early commitment and marital failure. It's a less stable arrangement in general, right, than marriage. And what Rignaris suggests is, here, where's my highlighter? Cohabitation plays to a man's advantage more than a stepping stone, since men retain for far longer than women the option to stay and form a family or leave and pair off with someone new, right? Okay. So there you go. Cohabitation tends to favor men in general. Women seldom want cohabitation over marriage, but they will tend to accept it if they forget to switch from a highlighter to a pen. Right. Unless they perceive, cohabitation as a beneficial, reliable stepping stone to marriage, or less risky than marriage, given the ambivalence about the man they are entering into a relationship with. And I think, there's a lot of this going on, right? Women are increasingly ambivalent about romantic partners who they see as generally kind of unreliable. Okay, in terms of its stability, cohabitation used to be a much worse arrangement than marriage in terms of stability. All right, so cohabiting relationships historically, on average, tended to last somewhere in the range of 3 months, right? That was the average. Now that's gotten a little bit better. The gap has closed. It's closed more in places like, France and other parts of the European Union, less so in the United States. Now, and in terms of test driving the relationship, making sure things work, generally speaking, historically, people who had cohabited prior to getting married tended to get divorced at higher rates. That's still somewhat true, but that gap is closed. It's now only slightly higher, unless you are what you would refer to as a serial cohabiter. So if you've lived with numerous other partners prior to marriage, right, it roughly doubles the rates of divorce compared to people who did not live together before marriage. Okay. Is that my last slide? It was my last slide. Okay. Breath. Okay. So this is grabbed a bunch of data from this piece, and this is an article that was posted on Substack by an author named Johan Kurtz. There's some interesting stuff in here. And here it relates to, we're going to talk a little bit about fertility, as I promised. And specifically, he has an argument about the cause of declining fertility. Oops, that's an arrow that's supposed to point down, and it kind of points weirdly sideways. Let's try that again. All right, my now much better arrow, right? Declining fertility, and why there's declining fertility. Because this, and I will say, because I just like to mix up some of the great social science mysteries. Declining fertility, I would say, is one of the great mysteries of social science. It's something that is happening in a lot of places, right? Like outside of sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Central Asia, global fertility is declining pretty much across the board. And we really don't know why, right? There's a bunch of explanations that have been proffered, but none of them, it's really easy to very quickly find, sort of for every argument, a counterexample of a place where that isn't true, where essentially, they also still have declining fertility. So this is not in a sense, super in-depth on each of those possible theories, but just to illustrate, some points as to why a lot of the kind of predominant theories don't really make 100% sense, and why, there's probably something related to status, which is really a cultural question, right? And this is where I sort of come down. If I'm coming up with a theory of why fertility is declining, I think the answer is much more cultural than it is anything else. Okay, so fertility is basically collapsing worldwide. And like I said, in 10 years, right, you're going to hear this. Maybe even in 5, maybe 3, I don't know. Maybe tomorrow. I have no idea which. I'm going to say 10 years, right? You're going to hear this, and everybody's going to be talking about fertility, and the global challenge of fertility, and how we need to do something to address fertility. And at that moment, you're going to remember me. And you're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember Professor Broussard. He told me tomorrow's news today, right? Because fertility is collapsing essentially globally outside, like I said, of some pockets in sub-Saharan Africa largely, and in places in Central Asia like Afghanistan, Pakistan, some of the other stands. Weirdly, Kazakhstan still has pretty high fertility as well. But outside of like some relatively small pockets of the world, we're generally seeing declines in fertility. And yeah, we don't have, I think, a very cohesive explanation for it. We have a lot of partial explanations, and the conventional explanations that people have proffered are things like economics, right? Children cost a lot of money. Housing. Housing has gotten really expensive in a lot of parts of the world, and that's delaying fertility. My pen has died. Okay. Let's reconnect. Bless you. Give that a second to charge. Declining religiosity, increases in contraception, and of course, increased access, challenges with childcare, right? Especially around that kind of mixture of that economics argument. It's expensive. You need 2 people working, to kind of sustain yourself. So you need childcare, lack of childcare, reducing fertility, right? Okay. Now, what does Kurt suggest? Well, he suggests that none of this really fits the macro data, right? Okay, so this is you see the kind of global decline in fertility. It's a little bit unclear when we're going to get there, but probably somewhere around the, roughly 2075 to 2080, right? So still a ways in the future, but not as far as you might think. Global fertility will drop to 2.0, right? Somewhere below replacement fertility, right? So then what you'll actually see is global populations start to decline, right? And then again, if you're still alive, remember me. Okay, so economics. Now, the basic economics argument for why people are choosing not to have children is essentially pretty simple to understand, right? Children are expensive. Children are, more of a kind of drain on your finances. And so, people basically forego having children because it's expensive, it's hard, and all of those things. Now, what you would expect if this economics argument was true is that, a whole bunch of economics incentives would raise fertility, right? Basically, if you promise people like a cash payment every month from the government, per child, that should sort of offset the economic difficulties. And if people want to have children, they will, right? So that's been tried in a bunch of places. And probably the most prominent one is in Hungary, right? So I guess he's now former Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but under the Orban government, and the Orban government, Orban government, one of the big priorities of the Orban government was basically keeping Hungary and Hungarians from disappearing, right? Hungary has a pretty low fertility rate, and basically, it's a really contained nationality. Its language and its culture are relatively unique compared to the surroundings. And so a cultural goal of Hungarians has been sort of to keep Hungary going, right? To stop, Hungarians from disappearing. And this was a big priority of the recently now defeated Orban government. And I think they ruled for 10 or 15 years. I can't remember. And one of the things they did was they tried all sorts of economic incentives to get people to have more children, right? And at its kind of peak, and that's really around now, Hungary, is spending somewhere in the range of 5% of the total GDP of the country on different kinds of fertility programs, right? Now, these range from things like cash, right? Like monthly kind of stipends for, per child up to a certain age to lessen the economic burdens, to tax breaks. And the most recent one that was announced, I guess in the fall, was that basically, so women who had 3 children or more would never pay income tax in Hungary, right? Basically 3 children and you will never pay income tax, right? Now, 5% of GDP might not sound like a lot, but it's actually an enormous sum, right? It's sort of slowly bankrupting Hungary to spend this much on its fertility drives, right? This is what, say, like the United States wants all NATO members to spend on defense, is about, or is it 2%? It might be 2% of GDP, right? So Hungary spends more on fertility drives than it spends on defense. I think more than it spends on infrastructure, right? It spends a lot of it. And the net result has been basically nothing. Fertility remains around 1.59%. Now, Poland has a similar kind of demographic story, right? It's a bigger country, so that picture is pushed out a little bit further. Poland has about a 1.69 children per woman, so it's still really pretty low fertility. Poland has a monthly, what you might call a family allowance, that's pretty generous per child, and in Poland as well. So basically, you get cash payments every month from the government, non-means tested, right? So if you make more money, you don't get less. Canada's child benefit, the more money you make, the less you get in terms of per child payments, which has weird incentives to stay poor. But that's neither here nor there. That's an economics argument. And Poland is the same, right? Poland's program boosted fertility for a couple of years by like 0.1 or 0.2% before basically like it flattened back out and it's now well below fertility. And this is basically true more or less everywhere. South Korea has tried similar things, right? And it boosted it from like 0.69% to 0.83%, or sorry, not percent, 0.83 per woman. Economic incentives simply don't work. And even in countries, right, like Sweden, Norway, Finland, that have some of the most generous parental leave benefits on earth, they're all now in what's called, what do they call it? Super low fertility, right? They're all, and that is basically any fertility below 1.4 children per woman. Canada's, by the way, right now 1.3. So we are now in the ranks of the super low fertility countries, right? So again, this could be like so can I tell you something that people always forget? You know, The Handmaid's Tale, everybody talks about The Handmaid's Tale. Everybody always forgets that in Margaret Atwood's famous novel, the thing that kicks off the like weird fertility thing, where, women are enslaved, is a fertility crisis, right? It's actually low birth rates that kick this off, right? So I think it's because of a disease, if I remember. But low fertility, right? There is the risk that this could lead to a constraining of women's rights. So if that happens, just, you can't say I didn't warn you. Okay, religiosity. So, religiosity probably also doesn't fit. Because outside of like a few really, really small enclaves, like the Amish or super trad Catholics, right? Even the most religious people in the world barely hit replacement fertility, right? So like we tend to think of evangelicals as pretty religious. And if we take the most religious part of that kind of cohort, right? Weekly attending evangelical Christians who attend church every week, their fertility is about 2.0, right? So just slightly below replacement. If you look at, countries that are relatively religious, Romania, Moldova, Greece, you could add Poland to this as well, right? Poland among the most religious countries in Europe. all of them have negative fertility, right? So religiosity doesn't seem to be a driver of fertility outside of a few Muslim countries in kind of Central Asia, and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right, that are also pretty religious. Fertility is well below replacement in most parts of the world. But just being a Muslim country with high adherence, like you could be Indonesia, right? Indonesia has negative fertility, and it's a fairly religious Muslim country. So religion doesn't seem to play that big of a role. Okay. Grade 9 curriculum at your high school mentioned the threat of overpopulation. Yeah, that was, excuse me, I spilled tea on myself. That's really interesting, right? Because this is like a frequent refrain. If anything, I think the thing that's more likely to become a problem as we look out, to the late 21st century is probably underpopulation and low fertility, right? And this was, I could do history on this. You probably don't want to hear me talk about this. I could talk about this forever. This comes out of you have this philosophy called Malthusianism, right? It's sort of a 19th century philosophy, or 18th century? It could be 18th century. I can't remember when Malthus was around. Where basically, the Malthus and then kind of neo-Malthusians after him were convinced that what was going to happen in very short order, I think I want to hear you think you want to hear me talk about this? I almost guarantee you don't. Malthusians were convinced, especially in industrialization, as medicine got better and birth rates really jumped and survival rates jumped with the agricultural revolution, that population was going to outstrip resources, right? And so that basically what was going to happen was famines, wars, as population outstripped resources. And this has been an idea that's really hard to shake, actually. And especially one of the so Malthus gets kind of widely rebuked, and he's proven wrong, essentially, because what happens is actually food production will widely outstrip population growth, and actually what ends up happening is more people get fat than starve, and so resources haven't actually become a problem yet. It's sort of repopularized in the 1960s by an American thinker named Paul Ehrlich. And he wrote this book, and I always get this book mixed up with a different one. I think it's called it's The Population Bomb. I always mix it up with The Late Great Planet Earth, which is like a Christian millenarian text that's about the apocalypse. I don't know why I always mix those two up. It's The Population Bomb, right? And basically Ehrlich predicted in the 60s that by the end of the 1970s, what you were going to see is a global famine, right? Wars and basically resource constraints so great that it was going to cause a real problem. And he advocated for strict population controls, especially in the third world, right, to be enacted. Now, that never ended up happening, right? And Paul Ehrlich, his predictions widely just never work out. But this idea of overpopulation seems to have picked up in the 1960s and never really gone away, despite the fact, and I forget who he made a bet with. He made this bet with an economist where basically they picked 4 resources. And basically what Ehrlich predicted was that the price of all of these resources would go way up as population basically outstripped production. And the economist, and I forget what his name was now, and it's going to haunt me. Is it all Bill Gates' fault? Maybe. No, there's many other things we can blame on Bill Gates. This is not among them. Anyway, Ehrlich made this bet with this economist, and basically they bet $500 that the economist said all of these resources will actually be cheaper 10 years on, and Ehrlich thought they would all be more expensive as population got out of control. Ehrlich famously loses that bet, right? So it's not Bill Gates' fault. But this idea of overpopulation has really blamed Elon for anything and everything. You know what's weird? Elon is a big underpopulation advocate, right? He actually is, and I think we should never listen to Elon about anything in terms of social policy. So don't take Elon's word, but he's a big underpopulation kind of guy. Sadly, I don't follow him on Twitter, but he's always on my Twitter feed because he's like forced himself into my realm of attention, even though I'd rather not hear anything about him. And I think he's an awful person in general for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is every female executive that has ever worked for him seems to get pregnant by him. It's not like he takes care of, I mean, I'm sure he pays for those kids, but he's not like a good dad. So screw that guy. And also, if you're a woman, please don't go work for Elon Musk very closely because, weirdly, I mean, I guess you would be super rich because, you were the mother of one of his like 92 children, but he's a weird guy. Now I got lost. Sorry. I got lost in the jokes. See what you do to me. This question of overpopulation, right, I think is pretty widely debunked if you look at the mainstream kind of demographics and economics literature. What seems more likely is we're going to hit a peak global population, at which point it's going to start to come down. We've never really seen declining population on a global scale. That's going to make things like immigration much harder. You can imagine a scenario where countries like, we get a lot of immigrants from the Philippines, where the Philippines are going to ban emigrating from the Philippines because a declining population is going to be bad for them, right? And yes, it was Julian Simon. You're right. That's the name. It's the Simon Ehrlich bet, right? Look it up. It's a very interesting story. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of things could change, but I think overpopulation is a kind of old idea that refuses to die. And I know Bill Gates is a big advocate of it, which is why someone threw out Bill Gates' name. But it's been around since really like the 19th century, and it just refuses to die despite, I think a pretty strong lack of evidence that it's a real problem. We have more, we've reached the point where there's more middle class than poor people globally. Well, obesity is a bigger global problem than starvation is. And I say this as someone who eats a lot of Greek yogurt because of this exact problem, though I'd really rather not. It's kind of gross. Okay. Only one person had a relevant comment, Julian Simon. Okay, good times. I like my little aside. Your grade 9 curriculum question has pushed me in a strange direction. Okay, let's see if we can do a couple more of these before I let you go. All right, housing. I think this is the weakest part of Kurtz's argument, to be honest. I don't really like how he put this one, but I'll present it anyway. But I think what's pretty clear is, there was this, so one of the big population declines, and this is the one we're dealing with as universities right now, is that, we had this 2008-2009 financial crisis, right in the point where your kind of earliest millennials would have been sort of in their early childbearing years, right? So what happened is birth rates crashed, right? And a lot of this was blamed on, okay, millennials can't afford the loans, they can't get housing, all of these sorts of things. Even as millennials' share of home ownership has increased, right, and millennials have started to do much better, their childless rate has not decreased, right? So they have more homes. I don't know why I picked this building. It amuses me. Would you like to live there? It looks fun. Not like there'd be good airflow, but fun. It's like, so what building do you live in? The one that's more ugly than words can describe? That would be good. Okay. So, housing doesn't seem to be at least a driving force, because what you would have expected is as home ownership rates rose, people would then have children. But we never recover from this dip that happens starting in 2008, 2009. Fertility rates never go back up to even their sort of, baseline at like 1.7 children per woman. And again, universities are now dealing with this, where we're hitting the beginning of what's called the demographic cliff, where we're starting to see declining enrollments, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier in the course. Okay, now, contraception. Maybe I'll end with this one. Wait, what's my next one after this before I promise anything? Yes, I'll end with this one, because the next we get into the argument. The collapse, so contraception, right? So the argument is that basically, it's, the availability of contraception is what's driven fertility down. But this really doesn't explain much, in the sense that global fertility actually, started to decline and here he has charts from England, but you could look at similar charts from the US and Canada. Fertility started to decline well before the invention of contraception, right? We get contraception really at the beginning of the 1960s, but hover, zoom, unsuccessfully, right? If we look at this chart, right, what do we see is that really declines in fertility started right around 1890, right? So a full 70 years before the birth control pill was widely available, right? Now, I think what happens is we tend to think that fertility declined because of the birth control pill because we have essentially a sort of a baby boomer effect in our mind, right? The Silents had a lot of babies. We saw that earlier in the course. And that convinced us that having babies has been the kind of norm in modernity, but it actually hasn't been, right? Declining fertility has been the norm in modernity for a really, really long time. The baby boomers and their parents who were the Silents, they're an aberration, after which it returned to the norm of declining fertility. So it started well before contraception was available, and it's continued afterwards. And again, we'll get into the argument next time. And here, right, if we look at France, fertility decline in France starts in around 1750, right? And this doesn't even go to kind of modern times, but a decline in fertility in France started, centuries before the birth control pill. So the birth control pill probably isn't the best explanation for all of it. It may accelerate the trend, but it is unlikely to be the cause of the trend in general, which is going to be more related to status, which is a cultural thing. But we will talk about that on Wednesday. All right, well, since I've exited out of my slides again, we'll see you on Wednesday. Ask more questions about the flaws in the high school curriculum.